Tonight, we're going to look at some of the best songs from the hard rock and heavy metal genres. We're going to take a look at the burgeoning underground that is occurring in the city of Los Angeles, and an auspicious start for one of the greatest heavy metal bands in the history of the genre. All this and more next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another episode of The Metal Dude Abides. Tonight, we are going to take a look at the best songs in hard rock and the best songs in heavy metal in the year 1982 and give them their long overdue accolades. As you know, if you've been following this channel, we go year by year talking about what the Grammys should have done. Often they ignore heavy metal. Often when they do acknowledge heavy metal, they get it wrong. So we're here to correct all the past ills. But before we get to that, we're going to start off with one of the coolest stories of 1982. Now, if you've been following the channel, you know that in 1980, the new wave of British heavy metal hit the shores, exploded, after a couple of years of bubbling up in the late 70s. Likewise, we chronicled in 1981 kind of the beginning of the California glam movement with the first album out from Motley Crue, Too Fast for Love. But there's another story going on here in that, yes, Motley Crue was the beginning of that movement, but now in 1982, we're going to see that there is a huge underground just waiting to explode. And it's all going to be, brought to the surface by a man by the name of Brian Slagel. Brian Slagel was a guy that loved heavy metal music, was working throughout the industry. He had, working in record stores, working for music magazines. And he decides he's going to put out an album with all of these great underground bands coming out of California. He puts out the unbelievably great Metal Massacre series. And in 1982, he puts out the first two of these. Tonight, we're going to take a look at Metal Massacre 1 because it's got some very interesting stories, and it really is going to portend what's about to happen, which is an explosion of metal coming out of California. So before we get into all the great songs of 1982, let's take a closer look at Metal Massacre. The opening track on Metal Massacre 1 is a song called Cold Day in Hell by the band Steeler. Now, this is pre-Yngwie Malmsteen, pre-Rick Fox joining Steeler, but at this point, it has original lead singer Ron Keel. Ron Keel would then, as I said, recruit Rick Fox and Yngwie Malmsteen to put out an album a year later, the self-entitled Steeler album. But tensions between Yngwie and Ron Keel were, bubbled to the surface, and Yngwie left just a few months after making the album. And Ron Keel, to me, is kind of one of those interesting characters in heavy metal that never really gets his just due. He's kind of, if you will, a poor man's Don Dokken. Not that he sounds like Don Dokken necessarily, but he's got the kind of level of vocals that Don Dokken had. Ron Keel is an amazing vocalist who really you can see through his interviews and through the work he did, first with Steeler and then, of course, getting his own solo band, if you will, Keel. He was a very driven singer, really had a vision for where he was going to go, but, just trouble with guitarists. Again, his feud with Yngwie Malmsteen. Malmsteen, of course, one of the greatest guitarists of all time. We'll hear a lot about Yngwie in the coming years, but Yngwie wanted to take the band in a much more, power metal, symphonic, much more around his guitar playing. Ron Keel wanted to keep the band more focused on more of a mainstream approach, centered around his vocals. I guess the reason he reminds me of Don Dokken is because Don Dokken had similar issues going on with George Lynch and ultimately led to their demise. But Ron Keel, like I said, is an interesting character. If you've never heard the band Steeler, it is one and done. They have one album out there, but it is actually a pretty good album. You'll hear early Yngwie Malmsteen. You'll hear the great vocals here. And then if you want to venture forward into the Keel category catalog, Ron Keel puts out 3 or 4 more albums that are all actually pretty good. So this first band, Steeler, has a very interesting backstory. Probably be hearing more about them as we go through the 80s. Just an interesting footnote here. Metal Massacre 1 actually has 3 different printings, right? So they put out the first one, it sells out, so they make a second one, it sells out, they make a third one, right? It's all the same. It's the same album, but depending on when you bought it, you might have different versions of it. And here's one of those interesting early changes. After the first printing of Metal Massacre 1, Steeler is replaced by Black and Blue with the song Chains Around Heaven. Now, I will say that Black and Blue was a band that I never really got into too much. It seemed like they were one of those bands that kind of, due to, eventually signing with a record label, they kind of lost their edge a little bit and really put out a lot of those kind of schmaltzy ballads. That's kind of what they were known for. Kind of moved away. As much as like Ron Keel reminded me of Dokken, Black and Blue kind of reminds me of Warrant in that you saw their potential and you see they have moments of heaviness that you wish the band would have focused on, but instead kind of the record label kind of moved them in a more of a top 40 direction. Black and Blue actually has a ton more success than a lot of the bands on this album, but not really a band that I, again, cared for too much. But so again, if you got the second or third editions of the Metal Massacre 1, you would not have seen Steeler, you'd have seen Black and Blue. So those are the kind of slight differences. If you're out looking for this album and you're looking for maybe that first edition, look for the Steeler, not the Black and Blue. So we'll talk about a few more of those differences as we move on. The second song on the album is a song by the band Bitch, Live for the Whip. Betsy Bitch, the lead singer, is one of the pioneering women in heavy metal, and I've always kind of wondered why she doesn't get a little bit more credit. Girls' School, part of the new wave of British heavy metal, gets a lot of credit. Doro Pesch, a German metal singer, gets a lot of credit. But Betsy Bitch just doesn't ever seem to be something that's talked about. This is pretty groundbreaking stuff. And I have to say, if you look at some of the great female singers in heavy metal history, Betsy Bitch has a hell of a voice. But kind of, you're going to hear this. It's a little bit of a broken record maybe, but Bitch just never really took off. Probably their biggest claim to fame is getting on the wrong side of the PMRC. If you're unfamiliar with the PMRC, that was the parents' music group that was against sex and violence and whatnot in the bad language in the music industry, wanted to slap labels on a lot of different records. Of course, it was led by, at that time, Senator Al Gore's wife, Tipper Gore. Bitch had kind of one of those S&M kind of dominatrix things going on, and I guess the PMRC just wasn't ready for that kind of act, so they kind of got put on the filthy 5 or filthy 10 or whatever, the filthy 40. I can't remember how many of these got on there, but the PMRC was really up in arms about a lot of the music going on, and Bitch was right in the middle of all that, but never really made it. But if you want to hear some really good metal, I think this song, Live for the Whip, might be my second favorite song on the entire album. I think it's excellent. I always thought she had a great voice, and dominatrix gimmicks aside, I thought this band should have been a lot bigger than they were. Uh, Again, as you move these bands out of the underground, you'll probably see a few of these bands that probably should have been bigger. But speaking of which, that's a good segue for the next song on the album. While Steeler was a one album wonder, we had Black and Blue, which had a couple of hit singles. We have the very underrated Bitch. Here comes the first band that went into superstardom. Rat with Tell the World. I've looked at Rat over the years with a little bit of, I'm puzzled by their success. Not that they didn't deserve it, don't get me wrong, but again, when you start looking at bands that came out of this era, much like with the new wave of British heavy metal, it's always amazing to me which bands make it and which bands don't. And Rat, a very talented band, but not much more talented than some of these other groups. They just shoot into the stratosphere. A lot of it had to do with, of course, we had MTV back then. They have a ridiculously popular video of a couple of years later featuring comedic legend Milton Berle. But we'll talk a lot about Rat in the years to come. They are part of this project. Now, interestingly enough, we talk about some of the slight changes. Rat is on the first two pressings of Metal Massacre 1, but is left off the third pressing. Not sure why. Maybe because Rat was, signed to another label and the other label didn't want them to participate any longer in this. But if you go back and get one of the original first two pressings, you'll see this song right here, Rat. And of course, they also end up on the 40th anniversary edition of this. So, one of the biggest bands to come out of the Metal Massacre 1, Rat, would Tell the World. The only band to make not one, but two singles on this Metal Massacre 1 is a band by the name of Malice. Malice has two songs on here, Captive of Light and Kick You Down. Confession time. I loved Malice. Malice is another of the bands on here. Didn't quite ever seem to make it. They put out two really good albums right after that, In the Beginning and License to Kill, that I thought were excellent albums. If you like, that early glam power metal LA scene music, I think Malice was amongst the best bands out there. Just never seemed to find that audience, never seemed to find that sweet spot where they were ever recognized. This is back to what I was saying. I'm not saying Rat shouldn't have gotten the fame, but you sit back and you go, why did Rat do so well and Malice just kind of faded off into the abyss? But again, if you've never heard of the band Malice, little early 80s undiscovered gem right here. Go check out their first two albums in particular. I think you'll really enjoy them. Another band I just want to discuss in here, because they're a band that is still making music to this day. Gareth Ongle is a power doom metal outfit that's been around since the 70s, still making music to this day. I would say that they have stayed in the underground this entire time. They have a good, loyal following, but have never really broken through. But talk about persistent. I mean, we're talking being in the metal scene like maybe even longer than a band like Judas Priest, for instance. I mean, they have been around like almost Sabbath type longevity. But again, never really cracking through the finding that fame and fortune. But a pretty good band gets their gets a little bit of a bump here on Metal Massacre. Before we get to our next band, I do want to talk about some of the other bands. Demon Flight, Pandemonium, and Avatar also on this first Metal Massacre one. But you might have been curious when I was talking about a band who got off to an auspicious start. We're going to finish off with the band on Metal Massacre 1 that went on to the most fame and fortune. Metal Massacre closes with the biggest band to come off this album. Up to this point, we've had some bands that really never got out of the gate. We've had bands that had long careers but not really get much recognition. We've had bands with some fame, and we've had a couple of bands that have actually had a pretty good run of it. But nothing compares to this last band. Perhaps you've heard of them. Metallica, with their song, Hit the Lights. I gotta say, this is the band we were talking about earlier that gets off to kind of an auspicious start. Why? Well, on the very first Metal Massacre, Metallica is listed, and their name is spelled incorrectly. Oh boy, what a blunder. And obviously the boys of Metallica were not all that happy about it. That was corrected in the second pressing, but also the song was changed slightly for the second pressing. If you go all the way back to the first pressing of Metal Massacre, the Metallica song, Hit the Lights, the solo is performed by a gentleman by the name of Lloyd Grant. Now, I have to say, I'm out here week after week giving you a little insights of the metal of the 80s and, little tidbits here and there. I gotta be honest. I had no idea Lloyd Grant existed. I knew some past members of the band. Somehow or another, I don't think I'd ever run across his name. So kind of surprised by this. But congratulations, Lloyd Grant. You'll always have bragging rights to say the very first recorded instance of Metallica here, you were the lead guitarist on it. Pretty cool. James Hetfield didn't like the way the first song came out. So by the second pressing, they changed the name to be spelled correctly. Big improvement there. But also the solos are turned over to another person you may or may not have heard of. A gentleman by the name of Dave Mustaine. Of course, Dave Mustaine went on to be the lead guitarist and singer of the band Megadeth. So here, and that version, again on the second pressing of Metal Massacre, is also the version that goes on to their independent tape that they were pushing around California, No Life Till Leather. Pretty cool stuff. If you don't know, I am a huge fan of both Metallica and Megadeth. We're going to be talking a lot about Metallica in the coming years. We're going to be talking a lot about Megadeth in the coming years. So I don't want to sit and dwell on this too long, but how cool is it that you see an early glimpse of Metallica all the way back here in the year 1982? Metallica never really is associated much with the LA scene. Some people may not know, again, that Metallica starts off right here in LA, but kind of gets a little bit disillusioned with the scene. They're going to run up with a gentleman by the name of Cliff Burton who convinces them, hey, why don't you come up to San Francisco? And they kind of start the whole thrash metal scene a few miles to the north. But at this point, they're still part of this big LA scene and included in this great underground masterpiece. Now, I do want to say that if you are interested in this, the Metal Massacre does have a 40th anniversary edition that has all of these songs. You might want to check that out. Also, I don't want to go too far into it, but Metal Massacre 2 was also released in 1982. Couple of bands, we just got through talking about one of them. They include the band Trauma. Well, Trauma still had bassist Cliff Burton. Of course, Cliff would, again, just as we were talking about, go on to be the great bass player for Metallica. And one of my all-time favorite bands Armored Saint also appears on Metal Massacre 2. So, like I said, we're not going to get into the whole of Metal Massacre 2, but it did come out later that same year. This is kind of the beginning of Metal Blade Records, and kind of the first time we really see a record label focused on the genre of heavy metal, trying to kind of pull them away from these major labels that were kind of ruining metal. If you be honest, they had their pluses, but they had a lot of negatives. This was the first record label that really comes out and just promotes the heavy metal. Now, a lot of these bands do go on to bigger success, and then end up on major labels. Again, we talked about Black and Blue had some potential, but again, I think their record label kind of moved them in a top 40 direction. Ron Keel, right? He goes on, gets signed on a record label, ends up hooking up with Gene Simmons from Kiss as a producer. I think there was some things there that kind of caused Keel to kind of go off the side rails a little bit, but right here, just pure unadulterated metal for metal's sake. Congratulations to Brian Slagle. Congratulations to Metal Blade Records. They really kind of were the harbinger of the great metal explosion that is just months away from Los Angeles. But we're here to talk about which songs coming out of 1982 should have been up for consideration for the Grammys. We'll see if any of these songs off this Metal Blade album actually make the cut. Let's start with the best songs of 1982, the hard rock edition. 1982 was, again, a surprisingly good year for hard rock. It's pretty clear at this point that heavy metal has taken over the scene, but there's still some really good hard rock. And a couple of, I don't know if you call them one-hit wonders, really kind of top the list here in our honorable mention category. I do want to mention them because they were pretty sizable hits for hard rock back in the day. The first from the artist Aldo Nova. It's Just a Fantasy. This song was huge, and again, really a pretty good hard rock song. The other was Billy Squier, Everybody Wants You. This is, again, Billy Squier, not a one-hit wonder because he also had a couple of hits, but pretty much fell off the face of the earth. Very similar to Aldo Nova. Really big in 82. Didn't get much farther than that. I also want to point out Rush has one of their best songs this year, Subdivisions. And Aerosmith, if I would have had a sixth nominee, would have probably made it here. They have an album, ironically enough, without Joe Perry. At this point, Aerosmith has broken up. Steven Tyler and Joe Perry have gone their separate ways. Joe Perry has gone on to do the Joe Perry Project. Steven Tyler still going with the Aerosmith name. They put out a really good song, Lightning Strikes. If you've never heard it, if you're a fan of Aerosmith, go back and check it out. This is that era that a lot of people don't talk about, pretty underrated because of the fact that Steven Tyler and Joe Perry were not together. But it's a pretty good song, so check it out. Now, for the 5 nominees for Best Hard Rock Song of 1982, we're going to start with a band we haven't heard from in a few years, Kiss, and their song, War Machine. If you've been a follower of the channel, listened to some of these videos, you'll know that while I was a huge fan of Kiss in the 70s, by this point, I've cooled to Kiss quite a bit. But this last album that they do with Ace Frehley, Creatures of the Night, has a couple of actually pretty good songs. Kind of the last little bit of Kiss history that I get into before I kind of move away from Kiss. War Machine is an absolute banger. Check it out. It's our first nominee. Kiss, War Machine. Our second nominee is from the band Night Ranger. Don't Tell Me You Love Me. If you were here last week, you know Brad Gillis, one of the best guitar players that came out of this era. While Night Ranger was much more commercial than the stuff he did, we talked about it with Ozzy. This has a great opening riff, very catchy. Love this song. Really gets Night Ranger off to a great start. Night Ranger becomes a hugely successful band throughout the early to mid 80s. But this, in my opinion, they start off with their absolute best song of all time. It's right here. Don't Tell Me You Love Me, Night Ranger. Our third nominee is a guy that probably needs a lot more attention than he gets. Sammy Hagar with I Don't Need Love. You've probably heard me, again, if you've been listening to the channel, complain about the era of Van Hagar that is going to occur in the mid to late 80s. I didn't really like the combination of Sammy Hagar and Van Halen. And one of the reasons was I just never thought Van Hagar was as good as Van Halen. I really love the David Lee Roth era of Van Halen. But one of the other reasons is I really also much prefer the solo career of one Sammy Hagar. I think Sammy Hagar, sometimes people look at his career, they talk about it at the very beginning. He's part of the great Montrose band. Again, ends up in Van Halen. That's probably his claim to fame. But he's got a very underrated collection of solo albums in between there. And in particular, I want to point out his previous one and this current one, Standing Hampton and Three Lock Box. This is some really good hard rock music. Again, if you know Sammy Hagar from the Van Halen, wasn't your cup of tea, but, give this a try. I think these two albums are excellent. I think Sammy Hagar is one of those undiscovered gems because of the fact that he's got these bigger bands on both sides. Don't sleep on his solo career. Really good stuff. Our third nominee, Sammy Hagar, I Don't Need Love. Our fourth nominee is a band from way back in the early 70s, Uriah Heep with Sold Our Souls. I got to be honest, I kind of stumbled upon this by accident. I bought Uriah Heep Abominog for one reason. It looked like a heavy metal album. Big tooth monster on the front of it. I thought, this is going to be heavy. And when I bought the album, well, it wasn't all that heavy. That was my first exposure to Uriah Heep. But, it is actually a pretty solid album. Again, much more hard rock than heavy metal. And many people might say not quite as good of the music as in their heyday in the early 70s. However, this song, what are we talking about? We're going to have to do math here. 40 plus years later, has one of my favorite guitar riffs of all time. I love this song. I love the guitar in this song. If you've either never heard of Uriah Heep or never really paid attention to this era of Uriah Heep, check out this album, Abominog. Pretty good. But in particular, check out Sold Our Souls, one of those songs that's just stuck with me for 40 years as one of the best kind of under the radar songs of all time. And finally, our fifth and final nominee, Y&T with Open Fire. Be prepared over the next few years. Dave Benketti is one of the best singer guitarists of all time. I love his voice. I loved the Y&T sound in the early 80s, and they're just starting to scratch the surface. Open Fire is a great track to introduce you to this very underrated band, Y&T. And the winner is Don't Tell Me You Love Me, Night Ranger. Once again, the opening riff to this song is so infectious, so great. Night Ranger's going to go on to bigger and better things. They're going to be a huge commercial success. But to me, their best stuff is right here. This song is just absolutely rocking. Fell in love with their guitarist, Brad Gillis, with the work he did on the Ozzy Osbourne live album, Speak of the Devil. Was, at the time, I talk about it, he was a relative unknown when he did the album with Ozzy. And it probably was a great segue to the hard rock heavy metal community when he then comes out with Night Ranger a few months later. People are like, oh, that's the guy from the Ozzy album. Probably gave him a little boost right there at the beginning. But boy, they deserved it. Again, Night Ranger's a little more commercial than I usually subscribe to. I moved on pretty quickly from them, but man, did they have a run. Congratulations to Night Ranger. What a great way to introduce yourself to the music community. Now let's talk about the best heavy metal songs of 1982. Our first nominee for Heavy Metal Song of the Year, Accept, Fast as a Shark. This is an absolute banger, one of the very first speed metal songs of its type, and I believe when you look at a career like Accept and talk about what is their signature moment, I think it's right here. Fast as a Shark, it just has everything. It has the speed, it has the drums, it has Udo's voice at full tilt. To me, this is Accept's best song and one of the fastest, heaviest songs that had ever been recorded at this point. Nominee number 1, Fast as a Shark by Accept. Our second nominee, Hallowed Be Thy Name by Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden is one of the greatest heavy metal bands of all time. We're here in the year 2025. Iron Maiden still going strong after, again, now 45 years? So when you say this is the greatest song in their entire catalog, that is saying something huge. And I'm saying it right here. Hallowed Be Thy Name, in my humble opinion. And they've got some great songs. We're going to be talking about Iron Maiden a lot, but I don't think they ever top this one right here. I talk about it a lot. The song, the story behind the song, a man on death row, falsely accused, his final minutes where he's questioning everything. It is an absolute classic. Our second nominee, Hallowed Be Thy Name, Iron Maiden. Speaking of one of the greatest bands in the history of heavy metal, Judas Priest with their song, The Hellion, Electric Eye. This is also, in many people's opinions, the peak moments of Judas Priest. There was a long time there where we talk about two of the big British heavyweights, Iron Maiden and Judas Priest. There was a lot of which one's better, and here we are again in the year 2025. Both of them are just still charging strong, lifting that metal banner. Ironically enough, or interestingly enough, the biggest hit off Screaming for Vengeance was a song called You Got Another Thing Coming. However, I pick Electric Eye because 2 reasons. Number 1, when we talk about all-time greats, that's saying a lot, 50 plus years of metal. I challenge anybody to find a better opening track to an album or a concert in the history of heavy metal. I love this opener, the greatest opening track in the history of metal. For another time, but one of my first just chills, goosebumps up and down my body type of moments at a concert, was lucky enough to see Judas Priest on the Screaming for Vengeance tour. They opened up with this bad boy, and it's one of those moments that even to this day, 40 plus years later, I just, what a fond memory, one of the greatest concert moments of my life. And I've been to hundreds of concerts by this point. So when you say that moment sticks with you, it's great. Our third nominee, Electric Eye, Judas Priest. Our fourth nominee is Motorhead, Don't Let 'Em Grind You Down. This is probably a personal thing, but I love this song. Motorhead has such a way, turn of a phrase, catchy. This is one of those songs that I just love. It really is a heavy song, but it also really brings out Lemmy's sense of humor. And this is a little bit of a sad bit of history, because this is really the last time we're going to see Lemmy, Fast Eddie Clarke, and Filthy Phil all together on the Iron Fist album. So a little bit nostalgic too. Our fourth nominee, Motorhead, Don't Let 'Em Grind You Down. And finally, the Scorpions come in with their song China White. This Blackout album of the Scorpions, I talk about, we talk about, I think Hallowed Be Thy Name is the best Iron Maiden song. I think, Electric Eye, best album opener ever. We talk about Accept with that really first great speed metal track. But I got to say, when you look at the catalog of the Scorpions, Blackout, if you say to me that's the greatest Scorpions album of all time, I wouldn't argue too much. Little bit of a slight lean towards Love Drive, but Blackout is fantastic. I could have gone with a number of different songs on here. Love this song to death. Love this album to death. Love this era of Scorpions to death. I think this is really the first album where Matthias Jabb says, now I'm the guitarist. My signature sound is going to start becoming the signature sound for the Scorpions. Love this track, Dynamite, our fifth and final nominee. And the winner is Hallowed Be Thy Name, Iron Maiden. Whenever a young band on the rise makes a dramatic change, especially a lead singer change, it's always a risky business, especially when you're moving on from such a tremendously loved lead singer like Paul Di'Anno. But Bruce Dickinson here proves that they made the right choice. Not only is this one of the all-time legendary songs, but it really established Bruce Dickinson as one of the greatest lead singers in heavy metal history. I'll be honest, I could have gone Electric Eye. I could have gone Fast as a Shark. I think all three of those songs have got to be in that top 10, top 20 songs of all time in heavy metal. What a great year for heavy metal. And those three songs in particular are all lights out fantastic. Slight edge to Iron Maiden. Now, the Grammys that year made a kind of an odd choice, or an interesting choice, depending on how you look at it. It's been a long time since they've picked a country western song for Song of the Year, but here they pick Willie Nelson, Always on My Mind. I don't believe we've been doing this, tracking the Grammys since the late 60s. It's probably been like a decade since a country western artist has gotten this kind of run at the Grammys. But I suppose if there was someone who deserved a run, it was Willie Nelson. He was part of that outlaw country western movement of the late 70s and just has a string of hits all the way through probably the entire decade of the 80s, if we're being honest. He had quite the run. I'll be honest, I liked Willie Nelson. I grew up in the country, so I listened to a lot of country music. You kind of had no choice where I lived. Probably more of a Waylon guy, more of a Hank Jr. guy, but Willie Nelson, he doesn't have the best voice going, but he is an excellent songwriter. So I don't want to get too down on Willie here. And this is one of his better songs, I believe, but at the end of the day, it just doesn't compete with the great heavy metal songs of that year. So not only am I going to give Hallowed Be Thy Name the Song of the Year for heavy metal, I'm also going to give it the best song of the year across the board. It deserves that kind of recognition. Willie Nelson will have to wait to receive his flowers later. And that's our show. This is the time of the episode where I pitch the channel. Go ahead and subscribe, ring the bell, leave comments below. All of these things help to feed the algorithm. And if you want to continue to get this great content, subscribing to the channel and getting alerts, the best way to do it. And next week, we're talking about the great songs. Next week, the Granddaddy episode, we're going to talk about the best albums of 1982. Listen, it's probably no big surprise. We're talking about Number of the Beast. We're talking about Screaming for Vengeance. We're talking about Restless and Wild. We're talking about Blackout. So you want to show up for that. Some of the absolute best albums of all time. We're going to be going through all of them next week and picking a winner. Ooh, it's going to be a tough one. In the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. as always, take care.